So, welcome everybody to the July Cloud Cafe. I'm Jenny Smith and I host these on behalf of Stroud District Green Party. And definitely just the face that walks in at the last minute with the very hardworking team that does all the legwork in the background. So, thank you to those as always, especially Elizabeth, who pulls together a great slate of speakers every month. So, this evening, we have got a really interesting topic, which I'm sure, if like me, you spend too much time doom scrolling on your phone, you'll be like constantly bombarded with this topic at the minute and different sections of it from different parts of the world. But hopefully, some of our speakers are going to bring it to life a little bit for us. So today we're talking about the New World Order and how will Britain face the challenge that it's faced with. So the world has changed dramatically since Donald Trump became US president for the second time, unfortunately. And Britain now faces a shifting global landscape shaped by the war in Ukraine, the genocide and ethnic cleansing that's happening in Palestine, the rapid rise of the Reform Party at home, and the growth of the right across the whole of Europe and what that looks like. And these developments raise important questions on how Britain should respond, who are our allies, and who can we trust in this? And is there a path back to Europe? Which I desperately hope the answer to that is yes. And that it can be a constructive relationship that we build back with Europe. So today we've got three fantastic speakers. I'll introduce each one of them. They'll do a short presentation, and then at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A like always. As the presentations are happening, feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and then we'll get you to ask them to the speakers later on. If anyone has any interest in links or books relevant to the topic, then also feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll make sure to share them with the recording on YouTube. So I will now introduce our first speaker, who is Richard Kirkpatrick, who is a campaigns manager at the European Movement UK, which is aiming to rebuild those relationships between the UK and the EU. So, Richard, I hope that you've got some great news for us. Thanks.
I think I've got some better news than maybe we had, 12 months ago, and God forbid, even before that. I won't even go back over some of that stuff. So thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Elizabeth. And hello, everyone. I'm Richard Kilpatrick. I'm the one I lead the campaigns team at the European Movement UK. And for those who aren't aware of the European Movement, we are an organisation, the biggest pro-European organisation within the United Kingdom, that is advocating essentially for as close a relationship with Europe as we possibly can get. We are also the biggest European movement in the world, in Europe, which is incredibly ironic. But actually, we are very proud to host, over 26,000 members, 250,000 supporters, and of course founded all the way back just after the Second World War by Winston Churchill at the time as one of the key pressure groups that he felt should play a really important part in ensuring that the United Kingdom played its role in what was the biggest peace project that the world had seen at that point, which then became the European Union. And the rest is history until not that long ago, and then it sort of became reality again that everyone had to deal with. And now we act as that key organisation that's advocating for improved relations with Europe, a closer alignment with the EU, and ultimately to rejoin the European Union. Or as I always say to everyone now, is we drop the rebit and we talk about joining. We talk about joining the European Union. And we should join that as a full member. And we also act as the secretariat of the APPG on Europe. And we are a member of EMI, which is the International Organisations of European Movements that advocate for that close relationship with Europe. And it's really interesting, actually, that we've just helped our friends in Canada create a European movement, and our friends in Iceland. So actually, the traditional boundaries of being friendly with Europe has changed since Donald Trump took office, which I thought was a really interesting development. So I wanted to stick really to the specific issues that apply to the UK, but also to Europe in the sphere that we work in, because that's where we do our work, and it's also I think it's quite hard to focus on small things when you're asked about, you know, that new world order and how Britain will face it, and the plethora, quite frankly, of issues that we face. Just as Jenny said, as you almost, I try to avoid as much social media as possible, really, to be honest with you, because it seems to be a crisis a day. And some of the humanitarian problems that we face is seems unending. So I decided that I wanted to try and focus on stuff that actually we tend to be very data led, or we've tried to be very data led recently. And one of the things that we do is a lot of polling. And we poll in the UK and we poll in Europe as well. And the three areas I thought would be really insightful: one is defence and security, one is the economy, and one is the general rise of the far right, which we've obviously seen as a major problem across Europe recently. So, firstly, on defence and security, I think all the polling that we've commissioned on this is actually incredibly unpredictable, and I think it's because it depends on, you know, what has happened week on week. It depends on who we ask. But while here in the UK we've seen this issue go down the list of priorities over the last 6 months, believe it or not, we've actually seen this issue, you know, increase quite substantially in Scandinavia, in the Baltics, in Poland. And Putin's invasion of Ukraine obviously poses quite a serious challenge to our intranational institutions, and those of us that still believe quite strongly in those institutions see that as a major threat. And actually, starting with Brexit, most predominantly, but actually for quite some time, those international organisations, those institutions that we've relied on for so long, have been undermined quite significantly, and that obviously empowers those within Europe that feel that they want to take advantage of that. So what should we do? And essentially, one of the things that we're really focusing on is that closer cooperation with our historic allies, but also to accept that we need to move to further alignment on very clear and technical things that could improve the defence picture for the United Kingdom, but also our allies that are in of an immediate threat. And there are some really technical points on procurement rules, on non-NATO operations and logistic aspects that we actually lost as soon as we left the European Union. You know, this is one of those many things, quite frankly, that people just were not aware of when we went for that very hardline Brexit, that actually, you know, the ability to procure equipment, the ability to move defence equipment from one nation to another, some of the baseline treaties that would allow the United Kingdom to act or to supply an ally, actually those rules were deleted on day one of Brexit. And so we are really keen that we focus on those defence and security pacts, those procurement pacts. That, to be fair to this government, we have made some small incremental improvements and steps on. But actually, we get very obsessed, I think, when we talk about defence and security, and in some of the channels that we operate in, is people get very obsessed with that headline 5% figure of military spending. And when people ask me about the 5% military spend point, I actually suggest that we listen to colleagues in Ukraine, and it's a really fascinating thing to do. I was in Ukraine in May, and one of the major points that friends there were making is actually, you know, because of the diversification, because of the now the requirement of the conventional spend and the learnings from that conflict, is that, you know, that 5% of military spending is a headline figure that doesn't necessarily translate to effectiveness in the field. So they're really urging Britain to learn from that point. And unfortunately, I think the government is still very much caught up on that 5% figure, rather than dealing with some of the learnings from that conflict. And of course, geography is still the biggest reason for being closer to Europe making sense. You know, our defence, but also our cultural links are so important based on that geography. So as we've sort of been seeing our international institutions being undermined by Putin from a practical point, but then also from Donald Trump almost theoretically, We need to form our own way, and I think that is forcing a reset of those alignments closer to Europe. And then equally on the economy, geography is really key, right? So we have a cost of living crisis across the vast majority of the developed world, certainly within the developed world, within the Western sphere. But here in the UK, we have quite a serious set of economic warning signs as well. We have some of the aspects of the Brexit red tape, which Mick, we were talking slightly about before we started, which, we have manufacturing companies, we have small to medium-sized businesses that are pretty desperately screaming out for representation when it comes to things like a veterinary agreement, when it comes to things like the cost of import and export, some of the divergence, some of the very, very basic divergence within packaging that has only recently come in. And it is forcing businesses to think outside of the box, and that outside of the box thinking often moves jobs away from the United Kingdom. We commissioned a report last year that surveyed thousands of businesses across the UK, and we followed that up with quite a few qualitative interviews with business owners, and the amount of owners that are taking their once family run businesses and actually setting up in Germany, in Austria, in the Republic of Ireland is just really worrying for those very like basic textiles, for example, businesses that some areas genuinely feel like an attachment to that economic sector. It's a big part of our identity. If you were to go to somewhere like Stockport, where we interviewed a business, a textile business that had been there in some way, shape, or form for over 100 years, and it's had to move to set up in Austria because that's where its client base is, and it didn't want to do it, but it's been forced to do it because of Brexit red tape. And then there's the loss of key industries, which again, I think really focuses on that aspect of identity here in the UK, whether it's the steel industry in Scunthorpe or elsewhere. It's a real loss of key industry that hasn't had an impact on quite an important voter base that unfortunately then moves elsewhere. And then there are labour market issues. So we would hope that a future discussion around freedom of movement is really important, that we have a real movement on a youth mobility, actually. I mean, rather than a youth experience scheme or whatever the government's decided to frame it as this week, is a meaningful youth mobility aspect, which is the first step in the door, actually, to really opening the debate around freedom of movement and improvements within that labour market, because we are seeing, just as across Europe is seeing, is a real stress on those labour market issues. And of course, there is the very easy solution to a lot of these things, which is ultimately market alignment, customs union, and single market access, which is a big stretch ask for us at the minute, but it's certainly on our agenda. It's the conversations we're starting to have, even if the conversation ends very abruptly. I think it's really important that there is an organisation that works cross-party to ensure that conversation is happening. So that's where we are on the economy, and where I think that the UK should be moving to. I think we've seen from the Trump tariffs and elsewhere that actually geography is a big important aspect of trade, and it's certainly the message that we get back from those small and medium-sized businesses when we interview them for our reports. And then finally, for me, is the rise of the far right, which is it's sometimes difficult for a cross-party organisation to like make party political points, but actually, the rise of the far right has a major impact on our organisation, and actually the internationalist movement, and those of us that believe in internationalism, because it's almost symptomatic of a lot of issues that I've already discussed, whether that's people who feel genuinely concerned about their security and it's an emotional response, whether it's because of economic impacts. And actually, the answer is all of the above and more, right? That's why people are moving to the far right. And to this point, I think that those of us working in this area need to actually help offer hope. We need quite an optimistic view of the future. Even though when it's really difficult and when we doom scroll and when we read things, it can be often quite depressing, is that those of us that are internationalists, those of us that believe in a better future in some way, shape, or form, and we might disagree on how to achieve that, but we have to offer an alternative and we have to offer hope with it. And that's why, at the beginning, I'm very keen internally with our staff team to say that we don't talk about rejoining, that we talk about joining, that we don't allow our opponents to frame the past, and we actually talk about a hopeful future. And I think it's a really important point. But the other bit that I mentioned when we talk about the far right is actually the need to listen and to test our bias. Because, I mean, I could talk at length about some of our polling that we've done on reform voters, which is a really genuinely like fascinating voter group to poll and to test at the minute. But I'll give you one insight, which is that we did some polling recently about EU UK environmental politics and policy, and we tried to really like simplify it down and work out where the British public feel future cooperation with the EU would be based on the impacts on the environment or climate change. And we tested lots of different language, but 54% of current reform voters put climate change as one of the top issues facing the UK. Like that's in the top 3 issues. After lots of testing of that group, we found that over 65% of reform voters would support taking EU laws on environmental standards if it reduced carcinogenic usage, if it stopped pollution in rivers, a really interesting connection to wildlife. So the way that they responded to climate change and the way that they respond to environmental damage and floods and the different usage of the language was really fascinating. And I think from that, really, what I'm trying to say is like we have a caricature in our head about that particular voter or like where we think that the world is going. And actually, I think we need to challenge that caricature and that perception, because I think by challenging that, it will allow us to be a lot bolder in that hope and that vision that we need to set, because ultimately it is hope or an answer to a question that they're looking for, rather than a negative reason for why they're voting reform. So it's obvious that as one of the key policy areas, I'm going to say that we should rejoin the EU. Join the EU. And that's always going to be a perfect response for me. But for us, we really need to focus about what we can achieve. Like we have to really build that credibility in our argument. And I think Jenny, you mentioned it right at the start. It's about that small step-by-step approach to eventually making it so obvious that that's where our place in the world is, because we know that ultimately those of us that are internationalists, those of us that still consider ourselves European, know that that's our rightful place, and we know that it is an answer to a lot of these issues. And we also know that it's a political sphere, right? That we know that there's going to be leaders in Europe that we disagree with. We know that there's going to be politics in Europe that we disagree with, but it's just so vitally important that we're there as a leader. And much more so now since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, since the economic stagnation, quite frankly, of decades of economic policy, that actually the United Kingdom has a very, very vital place and role to play in European politics. And I think it's a role that will ultimately be an answer to the rise of the far right as well. So I'll leave that there, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. A roller coaster at the end there, taking us like hopeful and then being like, oh no, but then also back up, because I totally agree. And we've discussed it quite a lot in the Greens in terms of reform voters. I very much understand disliking reform, who I think are unclear on what their policy even is. And therefore it's very difficult for voters to know what they're voting for, other than something that claims to be anti-establishment, which I think is what a lot of reform voters are looking for. Is they're sick of the main two parties. They're looking for something different. And actually on the doorstep, a lot of our field organisers and door knockers and people are finding that the things that reform voters care about are Green Party policy. And it's just like we need to capture that narrative. Like the left need to be we need to be better storytellers, and at the minute we're not doing that, whereas Nigel Farage is like pint in hand at the pub storyteller, and everybody is encaptivated by him, and we need a bit of that. And I think it's very interesting what you're saying about where their priorities are, reform voters, in terms of climate, um, economic policy, different things around the EU and stuff, because I don't think that reform voters, as you say, fit the caricature necessarily. Always, I'm sure some do very well fit the caricature, but I think a lot of them don't, and they're actually just politically lost at the minute, and we need to
Absolutely.
do a Peter Pan and find them all. Um, Thank you. That was a great way of kicking us off. Really interesting, and great to learn a bit more about what European Movement UK are doing. So everybody remember, you can drop your questions in the chat. I'm sure we'll all be mulling over what's being said, and everybody will spring to life as always during our final speaker. But I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Mick Fealty, who is a Stroud-based, we like the Stroud-based, who's the founder and editor of an award-winning news and opinion portal called Slugger O'Toole, which, fantastic name. It focuses on politics in Ireland and Britain. So, Mick, I will hand over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think what I've got here isn't really about politics per se, but it does fit in with the very tail end of what Richard just said. That it's all very well railing against the doom of someone else's bad dream. That's not something that we necessarily have to go along with. So what I'm going to say really is a kind of distillation of some thoughts I've had in narrating the Irish space for probably the last 23 years. I set Slugger up in June 2002, which makes it probably the longest continuously running political blog on these islands, both Britain and in Ireland. Although my dirty little secret is that I've always written it from here, and most people at home think that I'm over there. But that comes from just obsessively focusing on the one issue. So I'm going to start off with a little story. Quite a few years ago now, Friends of the Earth organized a green, well, not a green, but an environmental activism day in the Mourne Mountains. And myself and a couple of other journalists were invited to come along and kind of reflect on what we thought, was a way forward for getting the environmental agenda kind of on a higher basis. It was a kind of an overnight gig. It was right next door to Tullymore Forest. They basically decided to give us a break and take us on a short mountain bike ride in the forest nearby. And from my point of view, everything was fine until the instructor decided to take us off the little rough road that went through the forest park and took us to the top of a not very deep but quite steep incline, at the bottom of which the track veered off to the right, just beside a very large Scots pine, of which there are many in the Mourne Mountains. So the first four of us who went down invariably hit the tree. And each time our guide would patiently explain to us what we were doing wrong, but it didn't seem to make any difference. It turns out that your bike always follows the place where your eye is drawn to, and instead of looking at the path, most of us simply could not take our eye off that enormous tree. So one after one, we smashed into the tree, and it happened time after time. The only people I think that managed to avoid it really were people who'd been down that route before. So the case I want to make in this brief presentation is that populism is the tree, it's not the path. It's a consequence of our general failure, I think, to listen and to enact the democratic will of ordinary people. And that's why you get that kind of cynicism, I think, particularly amongst reform voters, but I think it's a general thing that kind of clouds most of the politics that gets generated or regenerated through social media. I mean, for me, populism needs to be, I think, redefined slightly. And it's a problematic term because, as all of us in this call know, that you can't get power in a democracy unless you have some kind of popular vote to be able to get you there. But it's only one of three working parts. So opportunism is also often used as a term of abuse, but grasping an opportunity can lead to effective long-term actions. You can see that in the Labour government of 1945, which more or less changed the social infrastructure in very profound ways that even the Thatcher and Reagan administrations of the 1980s weren't quite able to undo. And that was an opportunity after the war when people were ready for really quite dramatic change. But the third and much less talked about aspect of democratic politics is technocratic ability to be able to do the things that you've done, you've promised the people when you're actually in government. Purely populist, pure populism really projects, purely populist projects succeed against dry technocratic regimes because those regimes have lost their ability to speak like human beings. And I think that's a really profound issue. As I think Jenny said, people like Farage are pint in hand, will talk like some bloke down the pub, but they don't necessarily have any technocratic ideas to solve the problems that they're so eloquent in terms of describing, and sometimes describing quite accurately. I think the falling behind of the working class is a really big thing. It's a multi-generational thing. And whilst we might consider that reform don't have any direct answers to it, we're not necessarily, those of us who are kind of in the mainstream, and that can go from centre right to quite far left, those of us in the mainstream aren't necessarily in that conversation and describing our technocratic solutions with any great with anybody really listening to us. And so I think really, and I would measure this not just against the success of social media, but the failure of traditional media. The bottom end has fallen out of traditional media. We can see the S&J is not the paper that it was maybe 20 or 25 years ago. And that's because we are replacing a pluralist press with monopolizing platforms like Meta, was Twitter, now X, that basically split us up into what we biologically fall into very easily, which is tribes that never speak to each other and don't find common cause. And as this false world begins to speed up and rob us of our ability to think individually about the bigger problems, government must plod on in that slow, deliberate way that means that it's constantly being criticized for every small thing that goes wrong without necessarily anybody taking that wider view. And lawmaking it's a tedious process. Treaties and conventions, even trade agreements, take years, even though Mr. Trump is promising that he's going to have 90 done by Tuesday week. There's very little evidence that any of the things that he's managed to do will add up to any of that. So I just don't want to take up too much time on this. So populism is a kind of a failure, if you like, of governance. So we have these two speed worlds. We have the speeded up world of algorithms and Twitter and TikTok and all of these things that are monopolizing our identity as much as anything else. But I also think it's it also signals a kind of a failure of traditional economics. With growing inequality, the capture of markets by wealthy elites is leading to unassuageable public anger. And it is really hard to know exactly how we can put some of that anger back in a box in a short enough term that will assuage that anger and persuade people actually, after a couple of generations of losing time and space in the whole job market, how do we put that genie back in the box and give people a sense, as I think Richard was saying, less of a sense of what they've lost in the past and more of a sense of what they can actually gain in the future. A good example of how the economy is going wrong, if you look at the US stock market, 90% of all activity there is share buybacks by companies that are basically crowding ordinary people out of the stock market, so that markets do well even as the real economy is tanking underneath. And look, we have lost touch with the economic life of the average person, and I think that has kind of slipped out of the slipped out of our view, and I think the populists have simply moved in to befriend the most marginalized and potentially scoop the overall prize. So bridges need to be rebuilt, whether that's a bridge between the UK and the rest of the European Union, as Richard has pointed out, but more importantly, I think a bridge between the populace and the people who seek to govern on their behalf. We need to encourage new platforms that prioritize the sort of sense-making that helps us discern what it is the public want. And again, as Richard has explained, 54% of reform voters actually think that climate change is one of their top priorities. It tells you that some of our calculus is wrong. It's a more complex picture than that, and I do think economic inequality is one of the things that makes it hard to communicate cleanly and clearly to those groups, but they are feeling left behind, and very easily turn on anyone who is signaled clearly as a kind of a member of the elite, even when it's the members of certain elites that are doing the signaling. I also think we need to curtail the social platforms that are growing, these monopolizing platforms, to curtail their ability to exploit the data of private citizens with for the benefit of secretive third parties. We all know about Cambridge Analytica. But we've also seen just how powerful technocrats like Elon Musk can be in terms of really conditioning the outcomes of otherwise fair and free electorates. But then my final point is that when it comes back to technocrats, those of us, and most technocrats, as most civil servants, are people of goodwill and fair intention. But what they have lost is their ability to communicate real policy in the discourse of the parish. So to put it in more shorthand terms, technocrats need to learn to speak human again.
Thanks so much, Mick. Very interesting. Lots of really interesting points that you've made. I really like what you were saying around being able to eloquently describe the problem with absolutely no solutions to offer. I also like what you mentioned about tribalism. And for me, one of the things I hate the most about tribalism is how it stifles progress, and it stops us being able to find, these moments of common ground, which, going back to what Richard was saying, was for me a benefit of the EU. That's what rainbow politics forces you to do. That's what proportional representation forces you to do, because there's so many voices in the room. You have to find the person who's on common ground with you on that issue, and not thinking like, well, we don't agree on this, so we can't agree on that, with the yes no politics of the two-party system that we have in the UK, or in England, which is a nightmare. But yeah, so much losing touch with the average person, the failure of traditional economics, all of these things that we're seeing the results of right now in this triad of crises that we face in the climate, in the cost of living, and in just the world. Sometimes it feels. But thank you for what was a very honest discussion around the politics that we face and some of the issues that we have. So now I am going to hand over to our final speaker, and I hope you're all thinking of your questions already. I know she doesn't need much of an introduction because we all know and love her, but Baroness Natalie Bennett, who is in the House of Lords, but also a fantastic author, highly recommend reading her book. Used to be the leader of the Green Party and many, many other accolades I could mention, but I won't. I'll hand over to you, Natalie. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be back at the Stroud Cloud Cafe. The last time I was on, I was talking about artificial intelligence 3 or 4 years ago. So, I like the nice, really easy topics, like, Britain's geopolitical place in the world. And I think sort of a bit bouncing off what Mick said, to start off with, I'm going to focus really on the geopolitical Britain as an actor in the world, although it'll cross over with obviously a lot of what Richard said, but also some of what Mick said. In terms of, if we look at the state of the world now, I think one of the key things to recognise, populism being part of it, that a lot of people of the sort of Tony Blair, Polly Toynbee kind of ilk will say that this is a terrible degradation from where we were in the 1990s, and we've fallen back, and if we just need to restore things. And I very strongly disagree with that view. I would say that where we are now is the product of the 20th century, is the product of the 1990s, and absolutely we don't want to go back to where we were. We were in a right mess. We are in a right mess, and the answer is to go forward, not to go backwards. And in doing that, I'll stick a link in the chat box shortly. But a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece for the Green European Journal, which actually, thank you, Jenny, you mentioned my book. I will waive my book, Change Everything. The chapter in the European Journal was essentially a precursor to the International Affairs chapter of that. And it actually looked back on the 20th century and I think unpicked some very clear myths that a lot of people who really should know better still tell themselves. It's like, isn't it terribly sad that the liberal world order and the basis of the rule of law, well, we tried to install it everywhere and it all just fell apart. Now, this is the US, the UK, which backed regimes around the world, hideous dictators. Saddam Hussein was our man until he wasn't our man. Why did we get the current Iranian regime? Because previously we had installed the repressive Western-friendly Shah of Iran. So the world was what had been shaped by a profound failure to actually deliver on the US and the UK's promises of rule of law and the claims to be upholding that. And the positive of this, because I'm always looking for positives, is actually there were a lot of very good things constructed in the 20th century. And there were a whole lot of norms through the United Nations, human rights principles, human rights declarations that were agreed. And I think the most recent example of this, I think it's a really great example, something I talk about often, is what's known as Magnitsky-style sanctions. And they were actually didn't come from governments, didn't come from institutions. It actually came from campaigners who'd seen repressive regimes around the world, who'd seen the failure of attempts to sanction whole countries, which then end up with pictures of starving babies and people without medicine, etc., and said, let's actually sanction the individuals responsible. And that's what Magnitsky-style sanctions are. And that's something that grew entirely out of civil society. So if we look at what good things around the world came out of the 20th century, they are actually the things that civil society built. And we often say, what a terrible state we're in now because of Donald Trump, the US regime. Well, what a terrible state we were in the 20th century because of all the successive US regimes we had, which the UK, of course, went along with. And, the obvious ones are the Iraq and Afghan wars, but there were many, many more case studies. So I think unless you face that understanding of why are we in this mess now, a lot of the depression, the sense of, oh, everything's fallen apart, is a really unrealistic idea of what the history was and what the UK's place was. And behind that is also, and this crosses over with what Richard said, the UK has struggled right through the 20th century to find a place in the world. It was forced after the Second World War to give up the empire. Now, rather than acknowledge what had been done in terms of wrong of colonialism, the kind of damage that had been done, there was this comfortable fiction came along which said that, oh, well, we always meant to give all these countries independence. We were just waiting for them to be ready enough. And now look at what a good thing we've done is we've given them their independence rather than acknowledging that we had no choice. And so then where do we find a place? We go to Europe. It's a German Green leader who gave me this line, which I always thought was a good one. And when we were a member of Europe, we were the hokey cokey members. We put one foot in and one foot out, and then we swapped feet. And we never really embraced that. And that was tied with us following the Americans. And that's the history of where we got to, the things that's created the mess in our world and the mess in the world overall. And it's really interesting that there's actually lots of thinking going on, and I'll put another link in the chat shortly. There was actually a report out last year by a whole lot of terribly mainstream people, former head of the SCDO, former head of the Cabinet Office, called The World in 2040, reviewing the UK's approach to international affairs. And this mostly got reported as, oh, they've said we have to take down the colonial era generals' pictures from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. But actually, it was a much more sophisticated report than that, that basically said something I'd entirely agree with, that we have to regard ourselves as another middle-ranking power around the world. And what we should do is work together with other countries to try to have a modestly positive impact on the world. And I really stress that term modest because we're still far too used to, and you hear this from Sir Keir Starmer all the time, kind of marching into the room and going, right, we're here and we're going to fix things. And this is a wildly unrealistic expectation of our picture of where we are in the world and where we fit. And what we need to do is look towards a multipolar world and to be a positive force for good. I pick up a term from Emily Hafner Burton, who's an American academic, who says, well, we created all these great UN international norms, but they haven't been delivered. What do we need to do that? And she says we need states that will genuinely steward those ideas, those principles, and genuinely support, not just go, oh, right, well, I was challenged the other day in the House when we debated the prescription of Palestine action. And just before I spoke, someone went, oh, not quite pointing at us, but, well, all you do is talk about Gaza in the Middle East. And yes, I do talk about Gaza and UK arms sales to Gaza. But I also have always been talking about UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which, is one of the world's worst human rights abusing regimes, treatment of women, treatment of migrant workers, etc., etc. And so we've just used human rights as a stick to beat the people we want to beat anyway, but we haven't acted against states like Saudi Arabia. So what should Britain's place be in the world? We should acknowledge our own middle-ranking, modest position, acknowledge that we actually have some strengths in the world. I mean, the practical reality is if you get the Chinese and the French in a room, they will speak English to each other. And so we could be, as the native English speakers, we could be modestly helpful. We have a large network of embassies left over around the world. They could be being modestly useful and helpful. And get together with the majority world. Now, what does the majority world is usually taken to mean one thing, but here I'm using it slightly differently and taking the example of the global ban on nuclear weapons, for which the UN Nobel Peace Prize was won a few years ago, the drive towards this. And 123 countries in the world back a global ban on nuclear weapons. And if you want to think about one thing that the UK could do to have a real impact on the world would be for us to sign the global ban on nuclear weapons. And this would also be an acknowledgement of the fact that, I even know some generals and some air vice marshals and whatnot who would like us to get rid of our nuclear weapons because they say we can't afford them and have a regular defence force as well. I mightn't agree with them on everything about the regular defence force, but, I'll get on a platform with them and say, let's get rid of the nukes because that's what you do in politics is you seek allegiances. So Britain's place in the world, we should be a steward state, understanding that the only thing that's going to make us secure is a stable, secure world. Which brings me to the third point that I want to raise, which is what's going a couple of things that are going horribly wrong in terms of our position, the way our positioning ourselves in the world at the moment. One is the slashing of already collapsed levels of official development assistance, of overseas aid, to spend on defence. And what this reflects is an understanding of defence is about frigates and submarines and, goodness help us, nuclear weapons, instead of understanding that security comes from a more secure world. And we should never be thinking of defence policy in isolation. We should be thinking about, yes, defence spending, but that goes with diplomatic spending, with our diplomatic efforts. And one of the, it's one of those things that's not an easy political line to run, but they are actually slashing the FCDO and slashing our diplomatic spend. And, it's very easy to make jokes about what diplomats do and Ferrero Rocher chocolates and all that sort of stuff. But, diplomats should be, and often are, there in the world to help us understand others and help others understand us. And that is part of that broader soft power. And, also the British Council is in enormous financial difficulties. Our soft power is collapsing, but the soft power is very much part of our secure world. So you have to think of those three things as a triangle. And of course, but around that, overarching that, of course, is the climate emergency and all of the security impacts that has on both us and the rest of the world. And this is where I'm sort of going to circle back to what Mick was saying. There's also very much, and it's sort of, this gets touched on, but there's a lot of awareness. And I think it was Richard who was talking about being in Kyiv, and I was in Kyiv 2 years ago now. And, seeing how much, how have the Ukrainians kept fighting against the aggression of a vastly larger state with a vastly larger population. It's social cohesion, it's social acceptance of that war that's made that possible. And so actually, if we think about our security, the social cohesion, the resilience of our own society, as we come under, and we will in various ways inevitably come under more pressure in a more unstable world, the security of our own society, and this crosses over with what Mick said, why did we lose the, being of course anti-Brexit, why did we lose the Brexit referendum? And my explanation of that is the slogan that won the Brexit referendum from the other side was "Take back control." And that was because people didn't feel you look at the most disadvantaged communities that, broadly speaking, voted most strongly for Brexit. They didn't feel in control of their own communities. They had, and still have horrifically, I'm going to do something more about this when I get a chance. We have a Labour government going, yay, Amazon is spending more money and building more warehouses, as though this is some idea of something that's going to deliver for people. And Tories doing the same thing. The Tory peer and I had I managed to horrify him totally when I said that we should have the top paid person in an organisation shouldn't be paid more than 10 times the lowest paid person, and was very rude about Amazon, and he got very upset about that. But we need to make the UK a democracy. We need to make the UK a resilient society. Everyone needs to be able to have some food stored in the cupboard. There's been a lot of talk recently about, well, you should have 3 days worth of meals stored in the cupboard. How many households is that, the idea of having that much money available to just put food in the cupboard and not eat it is just unimaginable. If you're going to a food bank, that's not going to happen. So our economic structures, our political structures, we have the 34% government. That's the vote that Labour got in the last general election. If you count who voted, it was 20% of eligible voters who voted for Sir Keir Starmer. We have I'm seeing this every day, and the House of Lords today particularly is not covering itself in glory. We have a totally broken political system. And finding our place in the world means getting ourselves on our own feet. This is all part of the same picture. And I'm just going to do one final finishing thought, which is I always focus on hope. And it mightn't sound terribly much like that up to now, but my message of hope is that where we are now is profoundly unstable. The one thing I know is that things are going to be really different in 5 or 10 years' time. And that's really positive, because where we are now is really pretty terrible, whether you look at levels of mental and physical ill health, whether you look at just the lack of hope. Our job, and here I think I agree with Mick very much, is, our job is to offer people hope, to paint a picture. We haven't done a great job of that. We've got to paint pictures, we've got to tell stories, We've got to show people that change is coming. And final thought, I'm a politician, so I'll say final thought about 3 times. But my really final thought is my next book, which is coming out in November with Routledge, particularly focuses on a guy called Francis Fukuyama, who in the 1990s produced the End of History thesis. And his theory was that, you know, how things were in the 1990s in America and sort of Britain, where human beings had always been meant to get to. And this was the peak, the end of history, the end of human change. And so this current system would continue. And it would be just up to the people to decide that, you know, they have elections and things, and that would decide who runs the current system. If there's one thing we have to do is restore people's sense of agency, understanding that they can get together and change the system. They don't just have to live with this awful broken system, whether that's domestically or internationally. We can change the system. How we live now is just one moment in 300,000 years of human history. We've lived lots of different ways. We can choose to live differently. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Always an education. Again, lots of wonderful things that you mentioned there. Also lots of petrifying things, but always just as interesting. I mean, what you're talking about in terms of the problematic behavior that the UK has had throughout the ages. I really like this concept of us being basic, you know, like we think we're not, but we are. Like, we're just a bunch of basic bees. And actually the thing that we bring to the table is working with others. That's our superpower. We're, you know, with the glue that can hold people together. Like you said, we've got the language that connects across the continents. And really, like your idea on the stewardship, you know, like, let's be the mediator, be the person that makes things happen and hold people to account. Because I think a lot of countries don't have that perspective, and yet, because we have been such a global power and influence, be it good or bad, we have the possibility of doing that. Really interesting. And as always, I mean, I guess your answer is change the system, change the politics, change the system, change the education, change the nukes, change everything. And the book is named. There you go. Full circle. Love it. Okay. So I will stop talking now. I'm going to hand over to everybody else. So I'm going to have a quick look in the chat, and I'll pull people in. If you want to ask a question, or if you want to just say a comment, then feel free. Any of our speakers, feel free to come back on the question. Just unmute yourself and go for it. And if there's a few of you, then we'll sort it out. Okay, Craig, you go while I find another comment in the chat, if you want to go first.
Yes, that's quite a lengthy question. Since the 1980s, we've been living under a neoliberal agenda, which has had 2 very profound impacts on communities. So working class communities and others that are struggling resource-wise have, on the one hand, become poorer and poorer and poorer relative to the society that they're in. And on the other, through a variety of different pulls and pushes, everything from the way that the working environment works through to social media, etc., those communities that they previously relied upon to be cohesive and supportive and able to get from one paycheck to the next has been pulled apart. The far right, the reforms, etc., across Europe are picking up on that very clearly and saying, we know what the problem is. The problem is them, whether it be them, Europe, them, immigration, immigrants, them, people with different gender identities, etc., etc. And that's an easy message to sell, especially when you wrap it up in what feels like a positive, nationalistic, patriotic type wrapping. And so the question at the end of all that is, how do we create such a simple alternative story that allows communities to begin to become more cohesive again, and allows a sense of identity to be held, because identity is very important to all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Great question and great scene setting for our speakers. So tell me who wants to go first. Richard, you've
I'll jump in.
the draw.
Yeah,
Nice.
while some people make some notes or something. It's a really interesting question, Craig, and I'm genuinely, I find it really fascinating. So we at the European movement, we've just completed actually quite a substantial polling exercise where we wanted to go right into those communities and understand exactly how they tick, right? And with my so I've been politically active for about 15 years for various different organizations and levels, but actually I think what we've learned so far, or at least what I can share so far, is that actually community is still one of the, and I mean like geographic, your community where you live, Stroud, Manchester, wherever, like is so important to someone's identity, and still so important to someone's identity. So while I think we often simplify how we think something is going on the basis of influence to a group of people, and how that is happening, and how it might be a little bit out of our control because that's what makes us feel comfortable in accepting that that might be the way someone thinks. Actually, from all of the tests that we've had, is that community is actually the answer to some of the issues of, I think Mick mentioned, described it as like the monopolization of media and and thus the impact of populism. So, you know, community is still the most influential thing on a person. They need to, like, a person's natural feeling is the feeling of belonging. It's what they want to feel. Now, I think the challenge to that, and certainly the way that the far right and other populist organizations benefit from that, is actually they create communities online or they create communities elsewhere, and that is a big challenge that we obviously need to try and face in a more practical term, is how do we create those communities or challenge the far right's ownership of those online communities. And I think that, you know, we could probably do a whole webinar about that. But community is still influential. Community is still quantifiable. People can still see it. They can still see impacts in their communities, whether that's good or bad. And it's not always bad. Like the whole point of electoral politics and the way that political parties should win elections is to show communities that there is a positive aspect to what they're doing in those communities. And then community is still identity. So we did a really interesting focus group in the West Midlands, and you know, they were talking, like, the one thing that they were talking about is the car industry. It's the one thing that they identified with. It was their barometer of success in the area, right? And essentially, you could sway that group based on that focus group. You could sway it based on the experiences of the people in that room. So we introduced the idea of freedom of movement, and you can imagine people wanted to talk about immigration. They wanted to talk about this. That was the reason that the car industry had failed. And then there was one woman in the room that went, "Oh, well, actually, my daughter worked on the cruise ships, and now she can't work on the cruise ships because there's a limit on the number of days that she can work within the." And then slowly you could see people, "Oh, well, actually, you know, like, I want my kid to be able to do that," and you can start to see the room really change its attitude based on the experience of one person in their community. And they were, you know, until 10 minutes before then, they were absolutely unanimous about how important their community was to them. And actually, one of the things that we're trying to test, I call them elastic issues, is like what really pulls the elastic of someone's view on something, whether it's immigration or otherwise. And the one thing that's coming across is that if people believe that a policy will directly impact their local community, they're more likely to move on it. So I think that, I mean, it's really easy to say this because there's also the practical elements, isn't there? Like, we need to make sure that what we do is grassroots led, right? So people need to feel that they are being represented at the lowest possible level, rather than that top level. I think often, I'll be really honest with you, especially internationalists and people of that ilk tend to speak about that, like that top level stuff, and forget that politics is ultimately community. Politics starts as soon as you leave your house. and you can see it, and you can physically see the difference that it makes or doesn't make into these communities. And so the one thing I always try and say to our team is that, like, we need to make sure that the issues that we want to talk about is community, is that it has a bedding in community, and we can verbalize how we can and quantify how we can change that for communities that exist. And you can probably tell from my accent, from a working class part of the Northeast. I always call it, like, it's my local pub challenge. Like, I go into my local pub at Christmas time. I speak to my friends that I went to school with all those years ago, and I learn more in 10 minutes of talking to politics with them than I do with going to round tables with cabinet ministers, to be honest with you. So yeah, that's the one thing I would say. You have to make politics based in the community.
Great answer. Really great question. Great answer. Mick, take us away, and then we'll go to Natalie.
Okay. So really good question and preamble from Craig there. I'd say to quote a really great Irish playwright called Brian Delaney, we have to be vigilant about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I mean, I really mean that. In a way, I don't care what the story is or which political angle it comes in from, but we are telling stories and replicating stories from people who really intend us no good, even if they don't intend us actual harm. And that creates a complication for what kind of stories do we want to tell. And what I would suggest is that the stories that we tell have to be stories that are linked to action. Because one of the reasons why Farage can walk into a pub and hold them completely entranced is none of his stories are intended to lead on to action. But the stories that we need to tell must lead to action. And it's the inaction, if you like. I mean, one of the things, I'm going to quote David Cameron favorably, very briefly, and then slightly undermine him. And I think one of the important things that he said was that Twitter is not England. I think he's absolutely right. Online discourse is not real discourse. And this underlines what Richard is saying, what the great Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House of Representatives in America, once said, that all politics is local and everything else then is built upon that locality. The thing that Cameron got wrong was that it's not enough to say that Twitter doesn't matter, or that X doesn't matter, or that Meta doesn't matter. He had no real sense of why he was pulling together the policy piece that he pulled together from 2010 to 2016. And in fact, on 2015, he kind of almost flew in on a magic carpet and landed himself exactly where he didn't want to be, and had to call an election previously. And I would say that is a classic case of someone not being vigilant enough about the stories that he tells, or that we would tell, because Cameron's not alone. And I think this is a mistake that political leaders of the right and the left have made down through the years. So I would say, look, resist the temptation to look for a simple story, because the death trap there is demagogic simplification, that we do and replicate exactly what is being done to us. To give you a good example from Ireland, I would say after the 2010 general election down there, Fianna Fáil got back in to power after having been decisively kicked out in the general election of 2011. And the slogan that they used was very, very simple: an Ireland for all. Right, and from that point onward, through coalitions, through the agency of the Irish Greens, their old-time post-Civil War rivals to power, Fine Gael, Micheál Martin, the current Taoiseach, pulled together a programme for government that basically started to deal with some of the issues that the populists, and in my view, and it's not a popular view, Sinn Féin is certainly one of those. I don't see them as a centre-left party. I see them as an ethno-nationalist populist party with very few ideas, policy ideas of their own. It's only through the action that follows that winning of power that you can really start to build a kind of a stockade against further encroachments from the populists. And it's really important. I mean, Natalie is absolutely right when she says this cannot be a movement back to the status quo ante, because the status quo ante no longer exists. There's no safe place above water that we can go back to rebuild something of what we had before. So we have to improvise. And this is a final thought here. I think we have to stop pretending to the public that we know exactly what it is going to fix things. We need to basically have an idea of the kinds of things we want to do, and then basically be humble enough to allow ordinary people to fill into that space and fix the holes that inevitably will be in any plan that we go forward. So bringing the public into our confidence is absolutely a critical part of fixing democracy. Natalie, I'm sympathetic to the idea that we should need to change everything. I'm a school governor. I don't believe in school uniforms, but I've been losing that argument for most of the last 40 years. There's a lot of inertia in the system, but there's a lot of good within that even relatively inert system. So we also have to tell ourselves it's going to take a long time to fix some of these problems. We can't do it in the beat of a tweet. So yeah, and thanks, Craig, for a great question. Cheers.
I'm not going to disagree with you about the tweet, but I am going to disagree with you about the speed of change, Mick, because if you think about after the Second World War, Britain had 40 years of social democratic consensus. Even Tories believed in state ownership of coal mines and car factories. And there was, a weird little group of people just on the street behind me, the Institute for Economic Affairs, who used to sort of hold odd little lunches and produce pamphlets. And they had all these neoliberal ideas. And they were these sort of weird people out there on the fringes of politics. And then they took over, and lots of change happened very rapidly. So I think, it's not that the change suddenly appears out of nowhere because someone has a brainwave. It's what you're doing, everything you're doing in a community, you're doing with an organization, you're aiming to build that wave, and then the wave breaks. But, if you're on the shore, you might be able to see how big that wave is until it lands on top of you. So, I think it's any individual action, I've met lots of people who marched against the Iraq War and who say, oh, well, I gave up on politics after that because, Blair went to war anyway. But then 10 years later, across the road from me, Parliament voted against bombing Syria because the Labour Party and so many people were so scarred by the Iraq War and the impact of that march. So the impact of the march was 10 years after. And then when the British Parliament voted against bombing Syria, Obama decided he couldn't bomb Syria either. So, it's a case of you building forces that take time. But what I will agree with you about, really agree, it's a lovely line I may borrow, but being vigilant about the stories we tell ourselves, and also being vigilant about claiming that we have absolute solutions. If I claim one solution is whatever the question is, my answer will always be democracy. And so we need a world where everyone makes politics what they do not have done to them. And everyone can contribute to the answers, and picking up what Richard was saying about being place-based. Every community has large numbers of people who in different ways, in different approaches with different thinking, can find ways to work towards solving their problems. It's a case of giving those people the sense that they have agency, that they can act. And, if I think what's wrong about the current government, and I'm going to compare two cities here. I was quite recently in Doncaster, and, an area with an awful lot of social deprivation, financial deprivation, and there's clearly a lot of money being spent on concrete in the town centre. They've done a lot of work on repairing, and I'm not against fixing the odd pothole myself, but there's not any sense that they've actually invested in the community, in people doing things, in social enterprises, in community centres. It's all just concrete, and we're going to get some nice fancy shops. Whereas by contrast, year, I was in Ipswich fairly recently, and lots of people will tell you things are going terribly in Ipswich, but there's a huge, vibrant set of community kitchens, community cafes, all of those sorts of things that are building up. And so it's that sense of community. And just one final thing to add to this, and thank you, Craig, for a great question. We also have to, and I think Mick, you touched on this too, to think about, challenge our thinking. And we've been stuck in a neoliberal, a neo-Darwinist kind of mindset. And the idea that competition is what's going to get us ahead. And actually, it's cooperation. That's the whole foundation of human life. Lynn Margulis intuited and eventually was proven right that mitochondria and chloroplasts were independent organisms, and they got together in a cell, and that was the whole foundation of complex life on Earth. But it's all based on cooperation, not competition. And so we've really got to unpick some of the foundational ideas that are at the foundation of neoliberalism. And that means challenging thinking about science, thinking about politics, thinking about economics. All of those things need to be challenged. Thanks.
Thank you to all our speakers. Great question, Craig, and some really interesting answers it drew out in our speakers as well. So thank you everyone for giving your perspectives on that. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question's really about how the world's changing since Donald Trump came to power. I would like to hear the speaker's crystal ball gaze a little bit about how with the changing world, what the reshaped world might look like in the future. We've not got just Donald Trump as a superpower and destabilizing everything, but we've also got more talk about the BRICS countries coming in and challenging his way of thinking as well. So I'm just wondering what the speakers would imagine the changing world to look like maybe 10 years hence, with everything shifting so rapidly.
Well, let's hope it looks like post-revolution and we're all living a connected, wonderful, community-based life.
That's what I'm hoping, yes.
Yes, fingers crossed, Elizabeth. If not, if we're not quite there yet, then let's have a hear what our speakers think. Who wants to go first?
Shall I go first this time? It's kind of
Do it. Let's reverse
what I was saying, perhaps. I mean, I think we need to understand Trump. And Trump, some people may recall a book from quite a few years ago now, Naomi Klein, Disaster Capitalism. And what Trump feeds off, what the whole outcome is, lots of people will say, well, but it's not logical, and he's saying this and the opposite thing at the same time. And the aim is chaos, and the aim is confusion. And I think we're starting to see a little bit. Media is starting to realize that Trump said something vaguely positive in a Truth Social post last night about Britain. Oh, this means we're going to get the trade deal. Like, for goodness sake, just realize it's just a post on Truth Social. It has no meaning beyond whatever the meaning of the moment might be, and understand that chaos is the point. And if there's one thing I really hold against our current government, is I'm afraid there is a frighteningly religious clinging to the idea that, oh, but the US will always be on our side, and we can always trust in the US. And I'm afraid there is a deep lack of realism, which seems to be much stronger in the British government than, say, I mean, I think Mark Carney, slightly surprisingly enough, as the former governor of the Bank of England, has done a very good job of Canada, which in some ways is facing some very, very much more direct threats from the US, of at least standing up and standing tall and standing proud, and not crouching over and handing over letters inviting state visits and royalty and brandishing royalty, etc. I think the idea that you can, by being craven, get Trump to somehow or other stick on your side and consistently be on your side is just profoundly unrealistic. And even I mean, I was talking to someone I wasn't actually in the room when Macron gave his speech in the House yesterday, but speaking to someone who was, and they were saying how very clearly Macron was talking about recognizing a Palestinian state and just about glaring at Sir Keir Starmer at the same time. And so, we have to build something different. We have to build that in alliance with other people. And, we have to acknowledge what's going to happen in the US. I mean, Donald Trump is essentially dismantling the US Constitution. There is no guarantee in 5 or 10 years' time there will be anything like a recognizable US state. I'm not necessarily saying that's a prediction, but it's certainly a serious possibility. And that's why we've got to stand on our own 2 feet. And, I've spent some time with our military. I spent 2 days very recently at the Land Warfare Conference with the Royal United Services Institute and the Army. And there's signs at the edges of people starting to acknowledge that we might have to, operate without the US or even with the US, and they just roll their eyes when you say this, but the US on the other side. We need realism about how unstable and uncertain the US is. And I don't know what that looks like, but it's not, the US is not suddenly going to go back to Biden's US or Clinton's US. There's nothing like that in its future. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. Do either of our other speakers want to do a little Mystic Meg for us? Mystic Mick? Okay, off you go.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very attractive, does it? Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things I've forsworn in the 23 years that I've been running Slugger O'Toole is predictions, because it was an unpredictable world in 2003, and it's even more unpredictable now. So, and the half-life of any strategy is vanishingly small these days. You set out on a certain course, you think you're going to go in the right direction, suddenly you find storms hit the ship and you're going in the wrong direction. Trump's fascinating to me in a sense that I have really since 2016 kind of just shaded him out of my consciousness. He's really a media figure who instinctively understood how to make these media platforms work for him and in his favor. So in the classical sense, we wouldn't consider him a serious politician, and yet he's outgunned twice. He's outgunned mainstream politicians and become the most powerful, as we say, inverted commas, the most powerful human being in the world. Natalie's right when she talks about chaos, but the opposite of chaos is order, right? So what I would say here is some kind of opportunity for change, but the change isn't going to happen without our agency. Just saying that in 10 years' time things will be better is to skip over the fact that we have some responsibility here for shaping that future. And I think that's the thing, in a way, if you want to look at some of the downsides of the Fukuyama theorem that that liberal democracy was the end stage of human development, or at least human social development. The problem with that is that all the rules of political physics are set and therefore can't be broken through. I think what Trump is doing is basically helping us question some of the neoliberal stuff that was laid down. I put a little note in the chat there, basically saying, look, I've recommended a whole list of books. That is one of my top ones by Kurt Anderson, called Evil Geniuses, and it's absolutely brilliant because what it does is it charts these ideas from the defeat of Barry Goldwater when he got absolutely hammered by LBJ in 1964, the rise until it comes to fruition properly under Ronald Reagan. And really, since Reagan and Thatcher, this hegemony has kind of blocked out our capacity to think of other ways through. But our breakthrough isn't going to happen because it's going to happen partly by the facilitation of some of the chaos and disreputation that Trump is about to bring to some of those theories. And But, and this is where I slightly demur from what Natalie was saying before, it doesn't happen in the short term. It happens over at least 2 generations and possibly 3. If I look at the economic history of Ireland, where it really hits an inflection point from being a poor, inward-looking, agricultural country that has virtually depends on the domestic purse of the Bank of England, to the point now where it's a political powerhouse and an economic powerhouse in its own terms, with an industrial base that didn't exist before. It all goes back to one paper from the Department of Finance in 1959, which outlines some of the reforms that the state would need in order to kind of transform its future fortunes. That included things like setting up semi-state bodies to run and modernize infrastructure. It included the creation of free post-primary schools, which only came in 1966 when we had them from the end of the war. And all of the things that have happened to Ireland have been an unwinding of that 65-year period. So we underestimate, I can't remember, there was some science fiction writer who said with technology, we tend to overestimate its effect in the short term and underestimate its effect in the longer term. We have to somehow get our heads around the idea that this is not the short game that the populists want. This is a potential long-term game where we can do something to really change the direction of the ship, to put community and us, not as expressive individuals, but us as communitarian creatures who can find ways to actually build a better society for all of us. And there are so many things that need to be tackled in that, so many arguments that have to be won that we've been losing for most of the last 40 to 50 years. And Anderson really kind of tricks that out in beautiful detail. That I'm afraid this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the beginning, not the end of the beginning. And after that, we really have to start taking seriously our own agency to shape that future and not simply leave it to the market fundamentals.
Thanks, Mick. Richard?
Thanks, Jay. Yes, and thanks, Liz, for the question. I also try to avoid predictions as much as humanly possible, to be honest with you, because then I can't be held accountable for what I say. But I will answer the question, I think, in 3 different ways. And I think one aspect of it is, what has Trump taught us? I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I think that from my perspective and the European movement's perspective, I think Trump has underlined what we already know, which is actually a lot of the mechanisms of our international institutions are archaic, and they need to reform. And even just the way that the European Union has tried to react to the US trade tariffs, and this 6-month almost process of trying to legislate for that, means that there is just something wrong with the legislative processes and mechanisms that Europe has. So I think that that's one thing. I think that the way that the United Nations operates in general, as a result of Trump's chaos, has just underlined what we have already known for quite a substantial amount of time, which is that it's no longer fit for purpose as well. And I also think it shows that American society is. I mean, Mick mentioned this, and I would, for those historians on the call tonight, would probably agree that the American political system has not seen this level of division, and the last general election in America, I think the only one that you can really liken it to is the general election held in America in 1860. I mean, we're talking about that level of partisanship and division, and we obviously know what happened in 1861. And I think it's fundamentally a battle of values. It's a domestic fight that is happening in America, that unfortunately a domestic fight in America bubbles over into a foreign policy issue for the rest of us, right? Because of the position that it has. So I think that when you look at some of his actions, when you look at especially the tariffs, I mean, people see the tariffs as a foreign policy aspect, and there's a tiny bit of that, but actually it is a domestic policy issue. And I think that we have to bear that in mind, that ultimately a lot of what's coming out of America and the chaos that comes out of America is a battle for its values, and to a certain degree we have to sort of see how that goes. And then the so what aspect to the question, and to mention about the BRICS. I mean, my so what will obviously be that it already has put the UK, in my view, on a trajectory back to Europe in some way, shape, or form. I think the UK EU summit and some of the although I'd like to see it improved, some of the mechanisms that will be in place for a future relationship with Europe is already informed by the position of the United States. Especially when it comes to cooperation in Ukraine, and security and defense. It is very clear to a lot of the actors in that space that our closest ally can no longer be relied upon in the same way that it has done. And it's not about going backwards, or it is always about going forwards and changing your position based on that realist situation. And then just to finally, on a final point, I would say that it is just slowly undermining. I mean, the BRICS and the way there's always like there is a danger when we look at BRICS on a number of issues, especially when we come to like human rights violations, environmental issues, and all of the rest of it when it comes to that sort of sector. But we do have to face up to the idea that actually those international organizations, those institutions that absolutely desperately need reform and need people to engage with them to make sure that they represent communities that feel that they are not represented already in those organizations. Because I think that actually only through shaping those international organizations, whether it be the European Union or elsewhere, only by shaping them in the right way will we be able to actually create an antidote to some of the tyranny that's caused by actors like Trump and others. But unfortunately, we do need to accept that that's not been the modus operandi of those institutions 100% of the time in the past. Like, we have to accept that they are quite easily susceptible to criticism. Though organizations like the European Union, like the United Nations, need to be the antidote to tyranny, not the gatekeepers of it. And unfortunately, I think it's quite safe to say that in the past it has quite rightfully been accused of being gatekeepers. So I don't think that answers too much of a question. I think that just poses us all with a challenge, but I think it's one that we need to try and grasp.
Thanks so much for all of the speakers' answers and for another great question. And I think the answers that you've given to those two questions actually cover a lot of the other questions that were in the chat. So as we're flying towards the end of the evening, I'm going to now give our speakers a heads up that I will do a little summary, do a little thank yous, and then I'm going to come to you for a take home. So a couple of sentences. What do you want the people here that have listened tonight and the people who will listen to this at another time, what do you want them to take home from this discussion? While you're preparing yourselves for that, I just want to say thank you as always to our speakers for joining us, for giving the time to facilitate and participate in discussions like this. It's so important that we have, as I always say, have these discussions around the dinner table or around the kitchen table, because I think that that's really where change starts in our families, in our communities, and always being open to have these discussions is incredibly important. We've talked a lot about community tonight, the politics of communities, the lack of communities, the breakdown of community over the last generation and probably multiple generations is, for me, what's causing some of the friction and some of the problems and the divisiveness within our communities and within our countries and on an international scale as well. What we're seeing is this ego politics, the politics of chaos and ego politics. It's Putin politics is what I think. You know, Putin famously used to give money to pride organizations, and then at the same time would fund homophobic organizations. It was he wanted everyone to think he was their friend, and he wanted everyone to think he was their enemy, and so nobody really knew where they stood. And I think that that is a lot of what we're seeing in these I don't want to say old white men, but we can all see what we're dealing with. I think that one of the beautiful things that we're starting to see in the next generation is the diversification of voices. New communities are being represented in Parliament and in other institutions. I think what Richard was saying at the end there about the fact that we need reform, and not the kind of reform that's fronted by Nigel Farage, but the kind of reform that is going to break down the institutions that have encouraged systemic racism, systemic sexism, and a whole load of other issues that we're trying to reverse. But the kind of reform that's going to do that, the changes from within that only we can force. So make sure you can vote. Then go out and vote whenever you can, whenever you get the opportunity, wherever you can, local level, national level, international level. Run for something. Tell your friend to run for something, because we've all got something to say. And otherwise, the person who hasn't got something to say, or the person who can't say it, you should say it on their behalf. Okay, Natalie's unmuted, so I'm going to pick on her first to be our final word speaker. What do you want people to take home?
Well, I've been perhaps accused of offering prophecies, and I don't have a prophecy of where we're going to end up. I only have one certain prophecy, that we're going to see massive change in the next 5 or 10 years. And I don't know where we're going to end up, because history is not pre-written. So sorry, I'm not a Marxist, for those who like to follow these things. History is not pre-written. It's made by the actions of people. So the more we create communities, societies where people make politics what they do not have done to them, and also open up the idea that we can choose to live lots of different ways. And that's why we've been doing lots of books this evening. I'm going to wave. I got up and picked up The Dawn of Everything by the late, great, absolutely wonderful David Graeber. Always worth reading anything he's written. But David Graeber and David Winsome. It's basically 300,000 years of human history. And we've been on the planet for all of those 300,000 years. People have chosen to live in lots of different ways, and restoring that sense that people can choose, and empowering people to choose, and seeing what happens. You can't predict what's going to happen, but people together can and will make history, however it works out.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Okay, who's going to unmute first? Richard, you're up.
Thanks, Jenny.
Amazing.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. It's been really interesting. It's been really interesting to listen to Natalie, Mick, and yourself, Jenny. I think that the one takeaway that I take from this is actually that that value proposition stuff is still really important. That the debate for that value proposition is really important, because it can be very depressing, quite frankly, to allow that debate to be taken over by our opposition. And I say opposition, it's people who just don't believe in those internationalist values that I'm sure that we all agree with. And the one thing I would hope that people take away really is really listen to communities, listen to people, test even the language that you use. It's a fascinating thing. It's a really complex world when you work in it, but just test the way that you communicate your ideas, because believe it or not, the way that you can choose 2 or 3 words that can totally change someone's perceptions of what you're saying, and actually that person can still be totally winnable to your point of view. You just need to make sure that it's constant, that it's mindful of your audience, and challenge your own bias. And that's one of the key things that I've tried to bring to the European movement since I started working here. And we took a campaigning organization that had been battered and bruised from such significant loss that it was almost an identity crisis almost 10 years ago, right? And it's really challenging every aspect of that campaign, and really facing up to what went wrong. And one of the things that went wrong actually is that values point, is that actually, what do you believe in? How do you facilitate and keep internationalism alive? And internationalism is such an enormous space where there will be hundreds of different opinions, and you have to facilitate those opinions and almost, make internationalism as an identity great again. Dare I steal the line? But there will be debate for those values, and to celebrate that debate. And what I would ask everyone in the call to do is, take part in that debate. It's going to be an enormous thing that faces the United Kingdom, is where does its place in the world now sit? Like, take part in it, make it a community issue. It will obviously, we're not going to be talking about theory in our communities. We're going to be talking about practice. But in doing so, in taking part in that debate, one of the key things that those of us that didn't want Brexit to happen in the first place and may feel a bit bitter about it is actually, we're not talking about an election that happened 10 years ago. No political organisation should talk about the debate that happened 10 years ago. We should be talking about the next debate. And when we do reach that next debate, and when we do talk about the next generation of where the UK sits within the world, is that the plea to the Green Party and to any political party that we talk to is, do your bit in taking the toxicity away from that civil discourse. Do your bit to make sure that it is a positive vision, because that is the only way that we will improve our politics. So that's what I want, my major ask from you. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Richard. And finally to Mick.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be very brief, I think. I think I've got three sort of things I think people need to keep in mind. Words without action are worthless. They don't change anything. And I think we have really got into the idea of resting on the actions of people in the past, and thinking that that's going to save our future. Richard rightly mentioned the American election of 1860 that gave rise to the American Civil War, but also gave rise to the abolition of slavery, an absolute abomination on the face of the earth. But Lincoln had to break the Constitution to do it, because he wasn't legally empowered to do that under the Constitution. Now we have another American president who's treating the American Constitution like a plaything, but it is not the word of God. And we are going to learn things from this episode that we really need to kind of deeply embed. So words as well as actions in concert with each other, absolutely critical. I think the other thing is that and again, keep echoing things Richard said, but we need to reset the narrative from backward-looking grievance and all the things that have gone wrong in the past, including the Brexit vote, which, let's face it, most of us are responsible for. We were far too complacent when that vote came out. And we simply didn't do enough, and we didn't find the right people to speak for us. People didn't want to hear from George Osborne. He'd been lying to them for 5 years that there was going to be an economic disaster. We should have got Jeremy Clarkson to come and do it, because the people, the people that we needed to reach would have listened to Clarkson. But that is old spilt milk. Our real thing that we have to do is to reset the narrative from grievance to forward-looking common purpose. And if we can find common purpose in the things that we do, we can build alliances that are much bigger than the political parties that separate us. And the last thing I'm going to say is empathy is a superpower. If we start treating people who have been treated badly by the system and are resorting to extreme actions, we can pull them back in again. Years ago, I used to belong to a theatre company down in Dorset, and we did participatory theatre where we'd get the audience to create a story. One of my colleagues went to a youth club in Birmingham at a time when the National Front, not even the BNP, but the National Front was big. They started to tell a story, because the technique we used meant that you had to accept everything that the audience said. And their story was that they wanted to go to Africa to lead a protest march to tell all the Africans not to keep coming to Birmingham. And they got to the point, we allowed them to tell that story. We didn't tell them off. We didn't judge them for wanting to tell that story. That's the story they wanted to tell at that moment. But the denouement of the whole thing is that the main character amongst the protesters was a young woman who fell into the Nile and then and then a hand came down and she was rescued. And when my colleague asked whose hand pulled her out, it was a Black African. Those people told a story they were yearning to tell, but had no facility to tell, about the dignity of humanity, and that actually the values of the people they were drawn towards were not their own personal values. So I do think we need to use empathy to remind ourselves and other people that there is much more that unites us than divides us.
Thanks so much, Mick, and to all of our speakers for your final words and everything that you've shared with us tonight. It's been a really fantastic discussion, as always, here at the Cloud Cafe. But I think that there's a lot to take home. There's more than what's just been said in these last final few words. But like, empathize, listen, really listen. Don't just listen waiting to talk. I think that so many of us do that. You're like, oh, I've got this other thing to say. And I think that's not what we need to do, especially with these communities that have been left behind. Because like Richard, like Natalie have said, you know, they've been left behind, but if we actually connect with them on a real level now, we can rewrite that history, and or not even rewrite the history, but rewrite the future. We don't have to let that continue going on. And so every opportunity is an opportunity, and I think that we just have to take it. So whether you're in a climate action working group in your local town council, or whether you are a baroness in the House of Lords, everyone has a place to change something. So take it. Thanks for joining us, speakers. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everybody who joins us for these sessions. As always, it's always great to have you here. The Cloud Cafe community is continuing to grow and go strong. Thank you to the hardworking organisers, Elizabeth, the others in Stroud Greens who decide these subject matter and invite our excellent speakers. Please share the link. We'll be back. We're having a summer break, but we'll be back in September. So we look forward to seeing you all. And yeah, just like vote and